It is Wednesday, February 28th, 2018. We're in Marietta, Georgia for a very special bipartisan installment of Two Party Georgia Oral History Project sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. My name is Ashton Ellett, and joining me are a couple of Two Party Georgia alumni, Governor Roy Barnes and Representative Bob Irvin. Mr. Barnes, a Democrat, is the former governor of Georgia, serving from 1999 until 2003. Mr. Irvin, a Republican, served several terms in the Georgia House of Representatives, first from 1975 until 1979, and again from 1995 until 2002. He was also the minority leader for 5 years between 1995 and 2000. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining me here today. Very excited. I was hoping if we could begin with both of you telling us how you got into politics and how you decided that a life, or at least a part-time life in public service was the job for you.
Bob, go ahead.
Well, I was the state chairman of the Young Republicans in 1971. I had worked for the fellow who was then our congressman, Fletcher Thompson, in 2 different campaigns. And as the state chairman of the Young Republicans, I was going around the state trying to get people to run for office. There weren't very many Republicans that ran for office in those days. You had to recruit everybody that ran. And I was trying to recruit people to run. And then it turned out in the reapportionment session in 1971, there was an open seat that was created in North Fulton, where I lived. And so I just decided that I'd been trying to get other people to run. Here was an opportunity. I ought to do it myself, take my own advice. So that's how I ran the first time.
Well, I don't think anybody that goes into politics expects themselves to stay there for a long period of time. I didn't. When I was at the University of Georgia, I was a member of the Young Republicans.
Did you ever go to a YR state convention?
I did, and probably saw you there.
Probably so.
I remember I went to a Republican state convention in Macon when Gerald Ford came and spoke. I was 18 or 19 years old. And I was a Republican mainly because of Lester Maddox. I didn't like Lester Maddox. And some of our folks, I'm from Cobb County, but some of our folks from North Georgia were what I call Lincoln Republicans up in those mountains. And so there was a history there. I tell folks that Lester Maddox made me a Republican and Richard Nixon made me a Democrat. But when I came back from law school, I ran 2 years later for the state senate. Cobb had changed. Cobb had begun to change. 1970, Hal Suit, I believe, was Hal Suit.
Hal Suit
correct.
Was the nominee.
He beat Jimmy Bentley in the
Republican primary. And my recollection is Hal Suit had taken Cobb County.
That is,
In the
yes.
general election. And so Cobb was changing as several of the suburban counties were changing. But I ran as a Democrat and for the state senate, and much to the surprise of everybody, including me, I got elected. I was 26 when I ran. But our family had lived there and been in business, and I'd been in the DA's office after law school. So that's kind of how I got started. Well, I guess the real beginning was my father ran a general merchandise store that my brother still runs. And it was kind of like a gathering place for everybody to talk politics. And I liked to hear them. And I said, I might like to do that one day.
I imagine Cobb was an interesting place then. North Fulton was. I was thinking about this, that the House suit carried Roswell and North Fulton County in 1970 when he ran for governor, which was a complete surprise to everybody because Jimmy Carter's aunt, Emily Dolvin, lived in Roswell, and she, friend of ours, family friend. But everybody thought that Jimmy Carter would carry it because of that. But so many new people had moved in, and it was almost something that was almost a stealth invasion, if you will, of North Fulton by people who were Republicans. But there was a Republican Party, but there wasn't much Republican organization. All the local leadership people were Democrats. And I imagine that's kind of what you saw in Cobb.
It was. Cobb was that way. Cobb was one of the first really to start changing, and it was the same thing that happened. By 1984, there was not a countywide elected Democrat in Cobb County. Now, I've lived long enough, as you can see by the gray hair, that I've seen the trend come back, and you will have. I mean, I think that politics is 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards, but in the next few years, you'll have countywide elected.
Well, that's something I want to talk about in a little bit. Talk that evolution of the suburbs as a Republican stronghold, and perhaps we're in a transition period, or maybe it's a fluke from 2016. Who knows? But you both came into the legislature, House and Senate, in 1975.
I actually came in 73.
Okay, that's
close.
And the McGovern trend.
Yeah. There was a distinction, though, between coming to the House in 73 and 75, and the distinction was who the Speaker was.
Right. George L.
In 73, George L. Smith was still the Speaker, and then he died at the end of 1973, and Tom Murphy became the Speaker. So if you came in 75, you never saw George L. Smith.
Right. For Emmanuel County.
Yes,
George L. So
very different style from Tom Murphy.
Well, let's talk about since you both served in the House of Representatives later, obviously. What was that leadership style, and how did it shape the legislature? And how, now that you're out of politics, looking in, how has that changed since the Murphy era, 1973 through 2003? 2002.
Why don't you go first on this one?
Well, I knew George L. Smith, but I never knew him as Speaker. I'd met him a time or two. But Tom Murphy, remarkably, when I was in the House later, Tom Murphy was still Speaker, and the only lieutenant governor I ever served under was L. Miller. I served 16 years in the Senate, and he was lieutenant governor the whole time that I was there. Murphy, you have to go back a little bit to the coalition that existed. It was a rural coalition with urban African Americans.
Right.
And that coalition meant that most of the leadership came from rural areas.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Mack Wilson used to call them the Pine Tree Mafia.
You call them the Wool Hat Boys.
Wool Hat Boys, and everything. So, I mean, there was. Murphy evolved over the period of time. He became more moderate. Murphy, loyalty was the coin of the realm with Tom Murphy. I don't know any other way to explain it. He took care of his friends and he punished his enemies. I mean, and he ruled with an iron fist. And the Senate, when I was in the Senate and the House, Zell and Murphy were always fighting. I mean, always fighting. And, but Murphy ruled with an iron fist. Now, he did one of the great traits of Murphy. Murphy had bad traits, he had good traits. One of the great traits of Murphy was, number one is that he would let you back in. Al Burris is a good example. Al Burris ran against him in 1975. And then by the time that Al died, Al was majority leader, and Murphy had let him back in. So, I mean, he was cunning and he was smart in that way, and that he knew how to keep folks in and everything else. The second thing that was great about Murphy is, and only he could get away with it, it's kind of like the Nixon going to China. He did help, he was very instrumental in some things that were beneficial to the city of Atlanta. World Congress Center, some other things that were very, very helpful. Even MARTA, after it got established and everything else. But he was tough.
I'll give you that about helping Metro Atlanta. I think he did do that when the chips were down. And I'll say one other good thing about him too. He was a good presiding officer. I mean, there were a lot of people that came and went as temporary presiding officers, and nobody was as good as Tom Murphy. He was really good. George L. Smith had a very different style. He was very much of a gentleman.
Yeah.
And I mean, he was tough too, and he had his friends, and he ran the house his way. But he was always nice to people. And Tom Murphy's style was not to be nice to people. I mean, he'd insult you from the rostrum, and he'd say things that just didn't need to be said. And so I mean, as Republicans, we were always on the outside. And he told me one time, he said, "I have never knowingly voted for a Republican." I guess what that meant is somebody might have run as a nonpartisan, that was actually a Republican. He voted for him. I don't know what it meant. I have never knowingly voted for a Republican. So I mean, you could never figure out how to nice your way into getting along with him. And I'll say something else about him. I could not trust him. He would make commitments and he wouldn't keep them. And he'd make arguments about things that just weren't true. And since he was the speaker and since there was a short time frame, he could get away with it. But those were things that I really found that were serious flaws with Tom Murphy. I had no problem with tough. I mean, George L. Smith was tough. But I thought a different style in the House would have been more productive.
Well, in the 1970s, what were the top priorities that the General Assembly had to grapple with in the mid-70s?
The state was changing. The state was growing very rapidly. I remember, I think it was 75, we had the first $2 billion, $1 billion or $2 billion.
$2 billion budget.
First $2 billion
budget.
The first $2 billion budget. And now,
that was a big deal.
That was a big deal. I want to tell you, that was a big deal. And, now it's, 22, 23, I don't know what this year's budget is. I think the last one that I had as governor was about 13 or 14. And so the state was growing rapidly, and it was straining the resources of the state. And the state was not that far removed from when the governor controlled the General Assembly. That break did not happen until Lester Maddox was governor,
right.
And George L. Smith was the architect of that.
Legislature had been aching for that for years.
They had been aching for it for years, but they finally happened. And so there was still a lot of, you were only 6 or 7 years removed from all of that, and so the institutions had not built up as strong as they are now. For example, the committee chairmen were chosen by which side were you on in the governor's race, and and the speaker was chosen by the governor. And so that was a struggle during that time of building up those institutions. For example, we didn't have what's called an RSR, revenue shortfall reserve, until 75, to the big crisis we had in 75 when we had to come back into session and cut the budget, take salary increases away from teachers that we'd already given.
Very painful thing to do.
It was a very painful thing to do. And that was when we created, said we're going to have 3% of the prior year's revenue as a reserve. And it saved the state in many circumstances. I raised it to 5 and had authorization to go to 8, and I got it almost to 6 before I left. I didn't think 3 was enough. But anyway, it was growing pains. I guess that's the best way to say it was growing pains. Bob can give his views on this too, but Republicans got down to a very low number after Nixon. I think it was 76. I think it was about 21 in the House.
It was about 21, I think, was the low in the House, and I think 4 was the low in the Senate.
Yeah, 4 or 5.
And so, so things were changing, but they came back. I mean, they were and then Reagan came along and really added to it. And the change in demographics. You cannot, I don't care what you do about reapportionment, you can't change the demographics so much, only so much. And so infrastructure, education, fiscal responsibility, and the growth of institutions, that was what was happening in the 70s.
I think education certainly is the thing that everybody talked about. The Republicans and Democrats, I think, really did work together on a lot of those issues, which
particularly education.
Particularly education, and everybody believed then, believes now that a good educational system is the foundation of prosperity for any jurisdiction, and so that was one of the issues that was very prominent in the 70s. I think it's very striking when you look back at pictures of Atlanta in the 70s, and you realize how much development there has been since then.
Absolutely.
And some of that was due to infrastructure, of which the state played a part. I mean, the World Congress Center was an important part of that. The airport was an important part of that. MARTA was an important part of that. And very frankly, just over time, the number of I'm a Republican, so I believe in small government. But I will say that the expansion, the geographical, physical expansion of the state government offices in downtown Atlanta, that plus Georgia State University, that's saved downtown Atlanta.
Absolutely, there's no question about that.
Somebody you were both close with in different capacities was Paul Coverdell.
Yes.
Governor Barnes, you served with him in the Senate.
He was one of my best friends. He and I served in the Senate. We made immediate friends. When I went to the Senate, we had breakfast at least once a month on a Saturday for over 20 years. In fact, he'd been at the governor's mansion the week before he had a stroke and died, and had breakfast with him. He and I, Johnny Isaacson, because he was from here and I knew him, we raised kids together and everything else, and Paul and I, and Pierre Howard were very good friends. And Paul was a remarkable guy. I gave the eulogy at his funeral, and Paul was a great guy. I still miss him. I mean, he was such a bright guy too. I tend to be, and Bob is too, he may not want to admit it, we tend to be wonks. And Paul was the ultimate wonk. I mean, he was a very detailed guy and everything else. And he changed me in a lot of ways on political views. I don't mind telling you. I tended to be pretty moderate to conservative back then. Paul was what I call a responsible moderate, as Bob is. And it was a close relationship.
Paul was my best friend in politics. I met him in 1968 when he was running for the state senate for the first time, and I was working for Fletcher Thompson. And Paul was in the 4th of July parade in Roswell in 1968, and that's where I met him. So we became friends right away, and when I went to the legislature in 72, he had gotten elected in 70, and so we worked on a lot of things together, both legislative stuff and Republican Party stuff. I gave sort of a eulogy of him in the House after he died, and I said something about him then, which I think was really true. He was a lot of us, and I would say this is true of Roy, certainly true of me, that we strive and want to be partisan and bipartisan at the same time, right? I mean, you want to do what's right for the state, right for the people. You also, are actively involved in politics, and you need to advance your own side. And so, that's a tough balance. You try to be partisan and bipartisan at the same time. And Paul really was. I mean, he was
No question.
equally committed to doing the right thing and advancing policy positions that always made sense. And he was also equally interested in building up the Republican Party. He told me one time, he said, I figure that I've been to 1,500 meetings around the state trying to build up the Republican Party. And he said to me, I figure you've been to 500 of them with me, which is probably true.
And Isaacson's that way too. Johnny was that way, and still is. Of course, I don't serve with him, but I met Johnny when I was running in 1974, and Johnny was running for the county commission and was defeated. He was defeated by the last Democrat to serve from East Cobb. And
who was that?
It was Charlie Jones, if I recall. And I met him, I can still tell you, I met him down in Fair Oaks. I stopped to get a Coca-Cola, and he got out of the car, and I'd seen him at some of the things. We stood out there in the parking lot and talked. And Bob has hit on something. I mean, one of the things, I know we'll probably talk about this, but one of the things is you don't have to hate folks just because they're in the other party. We may be elected as Democrats and Republicans, but we serve as Georgians. And Paul and Johnny had the best handle on that. It's one of the things that really Paul taught me was that. And I think the animosity that we see, particularly on a national level, but it's become, Georgia operated outside the national level, particularly on the Democratic side, for a long time. Now it does not. Everything's nationalized. Everything is polarized and nationalized. And I'm not sure that's good for the country.
I think we spoke earlier about this in our interview. Is there a Georgia Democrat anymore? Does that term have any meaning?
I don't think so.
Is Mr. Irvin?
Not as it used to be called. I mean, this was, I think in a historical sense, this was sort of invented by Jimmy Carter when he ran for governor in 1970. And I mean, it rang true to people, which is why it worked. But he said, I'm not a national Democrat, I'm a Georgia Democrat. And what that over time conveyed to people is you were, a conservative or a moderate, you were pro-business, you weren't George McGovern, you weren't, those kinds of things that you would see in Washington. And I think it worked for a long time, but I agree with Roy. I don't think there's any such thing anymore.
I don't, and I still, of course, Hubert Humphrey, I think, has attributed this. Politics is a disease of which the only known cure is embalming fluid. And though I have repressed it, I'm like Bob,
Yeah.
I've come and gone, from time to time.
I think we're cured, don't you
Well, I think we're cured now. But anyway, I used to look at polling back in the 80s, and when polling really started to be used. Before that, it was not used much. And you'd see Democrats and people that would identify themselves as Democrats in rural Georgia, but they were opposed to what the national, if you ask them about the issues. Now, I'm seeing the same thing now as I still look with the Republicans. People that identify themselves, particularly in the suburban areas, identify themselves as Republicans, but they are opposed to many of the ideas and the positions that are traditionally that are associated with the national Republican leadership right now.
And I think that's true, but I think that's a condition of being the majority party. If you're a minority party, you're automatically, whether you try to or not, going to be more pure, if you want to use that word.
Yeah, sure. You don't have to make any calls.
You don't have to make any calls, but not only that, you don't represent as broad a spectrum of the public. I think that's the way majority parties are. I mean, there were not only South Georgia voters as you know, there were South Georgia legislators who I mean, I had one person, I won't mention his, I'll tell you his name afterwards, I won't say it on tape, who, when Al Burris ran against Tom Murphy for Speaker after the '76 election, this fella told me, he said, I forget who it was, called him up and said, if President Carter called you and asked you to vote for Al Burris, would that make a difference to you? Carter had just gotten elected president. And he said, I told him I didn't even vote for the SOB.
But, you know, it's, and I think what you see now is a deterioration of both parties. I think the Democratic Party...
How do you mean? Organizationally? The
everything.
structure?
Listen, here's what's happened. Young folks, well, first place, people in Georgia are much better educated than they were in the 70s when we first came. And that's number one. Number two, the state's grown so much. And so what's happening with many voters is they're not voting in the primaries. They'll vote in the general election, maybe, if there's somebody they like, but they're not. And I think that's a deterioration. And when you have that as a deterioration, you have a deterioration in organization. Listen, organizations of political parties are built around candidates. It's not the other way around. Mm-hmm. It's just like Bob said, he traveled the state recruiting candidates. It's candidates that build the party, not the other way around. There's no meeting where everybody says, we're going to make him the nominee and he's going to get elected. It's candidates themselves that are building. And that's the reason you see financial troubles with both state mm-hmm. parties. They're not being as well financed and everything else because people say, you know, I don't know if I'm a Democrat or a Republican. You know, they're Democrats some election, they're Republicans other. And this is particularly true in what I call the under 40 group that are better educated. They like some things as Republicans, they don't like other things. They like some things as Democrats, they don't like other things. And I think they feel displaced in a lot of that.
And I mean, I think it's healthy to have a large section of the electorate that's really independents, mm-hmm. that doesn't automatically vote Republican
knee-jerk
or vote Democratic.
I agree, but it is very dangerous for the primary choosing those because it becomes extremes on both sides.
And you hit on something that I think is important, talking about deterioration. I think civility is important, and I think we've seen a deterioration of that, not just in politics, but in society. And I think, you know, somebody said to me one time, talking about the legislature in particular, said, y'all are always so nice to each other down there. You're nice to people that you never vote with. And the point was that, you know, a lot of issues come up, and different issues have different coalitions. Yep. And you don't want to be in the position where somebody who actually is with you on an issue won't vote with you because they don't like you personally.
Yeah.
Right. So I mean, there's a rational and sort of useful reason for civility, but I think we've seen a deterioration of that in politics and in society, and I think that's unhealthy.
I do too. I agree 100%, and in fact, it's almost a demonization. Mm-hmm. If you're not with me, then not only are you wrong, you're evil. And I see that on both sides, both Republican and Democrat. And I think that is very destructive and very caustic to the body politic.
Can you pinpoint, not necessarily a year or an event where perhaps there was an inflection point from what you were talking about, where there's sort of there's cooperation, there's comedy, there's a professionalism, as you mentioned, to something that's harsher in tone, more invective?
I don't know. I mean, I think both sides blame the other side, and so I can't point to a particular event, but I do think both sides are to blame. I agree with you.
Yeah, I think, you know, it may be a mark of our society. I hate to say that, but you know, I remember as a kid growing up, and I still do it, but one of the things, if you be at a red light and light change and the person in front of you wasn't paying attention, saw the light change, you'd never blow the horn at them.
Right. That happens all the time
now you wait 2 seconds and the horn gets blown. I think it may be a representative of just really a change in society, and I think this country needs a good introspection and discussion of itself, and a lot of the what I call stereotypes. One of the other things that I will tell you, back in the 70s too, Republicans were very moderate on race relations, and the Democrats, particularly the rural Democrats, were not. And it's one of the things that drew me to Paul. Paul was very moderate on race relations, and so was Johnny. And Bob Bell, and Jim Tysinger, who sat right behind me. All of these, I ended up being Jim's lawyer, and I represented Johnny, and all these other things. We invested. Paul, when Paul was building his company, he came to me and he says, "You know where I can get a loan to buy a building?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "We'll do it." And I did I arranged and negotiated a loan for it. I think a lot of that personal goes a long way. And then the other thing that attracted me, as I said, was Democrats were pretty harsh on rural Democrats particularly, and the urban Democrats hadn't changed that much. Were pretty rough on race relations. I'll tell you this story, and I've told it publicly before, but when we had the Martin Luther King birthday, it was a very controversial issue. And the first time it came to the Senate, I voted for it, and I thought they were going to burn my house down here. Second time it came back, I voted against it. And the third time it came back, I went to the bathroom. It was the worst act of political cowardice that there was at the time. Within 6 months, I went to Ms. King and apologized to her about it. But it was a good example of the way things were, even in the Democratic side and everything else. And Paul and Bob and others that were leaders were very moderate on race. And that probably changed me more than anything and Paul was originally from Iowa, wasn't he?
Right.
And Paul didn't, he was not caught up in these Southern stereotypes. And when we drank coffee in the morning, we sat right across from each other. When we drank coffee, and when I was the governor's floor leader in the 80s, I'd call him. We first got car phones. I'd call him on the car phones we had in there at home, and we'd talk coming in, and I'd say, "I got this coming up." I said, "Can you help me with it?" And everything else. I talked to Paul Coverdell more than I talked to the governor, and I was his floor leader.
So I'll tell you a story about car phones. This is about Everett Dirksen and Lbj, and they had car phones before we had car phones, right? But Lbj had a car phone. He was always calling Dirksen, and Dirksen finally got one, and so he called Lbj in Johnson's car when he was the majority leader, and he was just trying to prove that he had a car phone, and Johnson said, "Just excuse me, Ev, my other line is ringing."
But that's a good. I don't know if you've listened to the tapes, the Johnson tapes, but he and Dirksen were good friends. You can tell that on the phone. One of the most interesting ones I listened to was Johnson and Dirksen were talking the morning after the election in '64, and Dirksen says, "Well, you beat my good friend so and so," and they talked about, "Yeah, but you kept that, and everything." And then they talked about, "Ev, how you doing?" "Well, I'm not feeling too good." "Well, let me send a plane to pick you up and take you down to Florida." And that is almost unbelievable that would happen today in today's politics. And if it had not been for Everett Dirksen, the Civil Rights Act would never have passed.
Yeah, that's certainly
True.
I mean, that was, it was, and so it was, you have to understand the time and that was going through there. And I think probably the greatest contribution, at least to me, during the 70s and early 80s from the Republican minority at the time was forming my views on race. And they changed, I changed, and of course you know the rest of the story and things like that, and I became very sensitive to it. And that was because of Paul Coverdell.
And I think the Martin Luther King birthday bill is a good example of how times change and how something that's not achievable at some point, you know, becomes achievable in the future, becomes in the way, you know, almost inevitable. I mean, I remember the first time that I ever saw the Martin Luther King birthday bill. J.C. Doherty was bringing it around,
I remember J.C.
and I was sitting next to Mike Egan, and Mike Egan said, "You bastard, you know I can't sign this." and so, you know, Mike didn't sign it, and, you know, if Mike didn't sign it, I wasn't going to sign it either.
Yeah.
Right? So, but that would have been maybe 77 or 76 or something. And then by the time Reagan issued the proclamation,
It made it a lot easier.
it was a non-issue, right? I mean, nobody objected to it.
A lot of cover.
Not only a lot of cover, but I mean, it was, Reagan wasn't taking a big risk either. I mean, he was taking something of a risk, but it wasn't a big risk. The times had evolved so that something that was impossible to get done, you know, 10 years before was not only possible, it was actually fairly easy.
And, you know, Jack had always been a big proponent. In fact, it was his bill that Reagan signed. Mm-hmm. I got to be friends, I think I told you this story when you interviewed me, but I got to be friends with Jack Kemp during the flag change. He came down here and stayed with me 3 days. And during the flag change, and helped me. I mean, you know, and I met him at a Martin Luther King celebration at Ebenezer. He was the speaker that year. And I knew that I was going to do it. This was 2001. And I told him that, you know, because he had said that, you know, this flag needs to go. It needs to be changed. And I followed him out in the parking lot and I said, "Give me your cell number." And he came I called him, he was in Tampa, I believe it was, at the Super Bowl, and I called him and I told him what I was going to do and could he come up and help me. He said, "Sure." He said, "I'll be there." And he stayed with me 3 days. Used my office.
I think the two people that made the greatest impact on conservative thought, if you want to call it that, in the last half century were William F. Buckley and Jackie Kemp. Mm-hmm. Buckley drove the anti-Semites and the anti-Catholics out of conservatism. Mm-hmm. And Kemp drove the racists out of conservatism.
Yeah, I think that's true. I'm not as much on Buckley because I hadn't studied him, but it is definitely true of Kemp. And I liked him. I really do. I know I'm just talking about Republicans today, but the Democrats I like too, but you know, and work with, but and that I thought were very courageous. But I guess we need another one of those on both sides.
Well, you've mentioned how times have changed, and how did the parties, the legislatures, the priorities, the challenges facing the state, how were they different in the 1990s when you're both serving in the House of Representatives? When you both got in there early mid-90s, what were the challenges facing the state, and how had the parties changed from that time you were talking about in the 1970s with the Mike Egans and the Paul Coverdells of the world? How had the Democratic Party changed? How had the Republican Party changed? How had the state changed?
Well, the state was changing. I mean, the state, and kind of in the 90s was the culmination of it. particularly the late 90s. You had the first, Bob, was it 94 when Oxendine and Linda
94.
Shrinko were first statewide elections.
And Mike Bowers.
Yeah, Mike changed.
Mike
changed parties in 94. And so, it was here. And the second thing, too, is that, and the rule, it was, in 98, I was able to hold the rural folks together enough, and I was able to eat into the suburban enough because I was from here. You don't have to win in Republican areas, but if you can get 40%, you're elected. I mean, that was the deal back then.
And I'll tell you in a minute how we always thought about it.
Yeah. But because you had the rural areas were still, it was breaking down, and there's several things happening in rural areas. In rural areas, they were breaking down, and the rural areas were being depopulated.
Right.
So there were fewer
Weren't
folks.
that many.
There were not that many. I mean, it was not as great. So that was what had changed in 20 years. Now, let's face it, George Busby was from Albany, Georgia, as they said. Joe Frank Harris was the first North Georgia governor, really in modern times, to be elected, and that was in '82. But the other thing, too, is that you started electing some Republicans, what I call Republicans out of convenience, that were not as moderate as Paul Coverdell or Bob Irvin or Johnny Isakson. And the Democrats, you started electing more and more that were too far progressive. In other words, the state of Georgia is like any other state. It's the broad middle and the independent voters that end up doing it. And but as both parties started to change, you elected some, that were not what I considered to be in the mainstream. What was the old boy that pulled the gun on Mike Egan that time that changed to Republican?
Oh, Vincent Wall. He was a Democrat when he did that.
I know, but he was a Republican soon thereafter. I don't even know if Vincent's still around.
I don't know either.
But Vincent was a Democrat from Gwinnett County, and Mike Egan, who was a great guy too, very bright guy. Mike was minority leader, and Vincent literally pulled a gun in the well and pointed it toward Mike.
He did. Now this was part of the debate. I mean, he wasn't actually intending to shoot
him.
This was about the death penalty.
Yeah.
And he pulled out this pistol and he said, "Now suppose I would shoot the gentleman from the 25th."
Yeah. And it
was a bit of a shock.
And Vincent, of course, as Gwinnett County changed, became a Republican. The parties started swapping back and forth.
Let me just finish that story. Mike was sitting there. Of course, Mike's cool guy. Now he got up and he walked backwards out of the chamber, and Joe Mack Wilson yelled over at him, said, "Egan, what you still walking around for?"
Oh goodness! But anyway, it started to change and became more and more unsettled, and then. In 2002, when I got beat, the Senate changed. Well, the House changed, but the Senate was still Democrat, but there was enough switchers. I think there was about 4 or 5 switchers.
4 or 5 switchers.
And it gave the Republicans majority in the Senate.
The way we always thought about statewide elections was kind of the opposite of what you were thinking about, that we do well enough in the metro areas to win. But in the rural parts of the state, especially in South Georgia, you'd see the returns come in from county after county, and it was, 3,000 votes to 2,000 votes. Democrats get 3,000, we'd get 2,000. And you think, well, that's doing okay in that county, right? But then 100 counties like that, you're 100,000 votes behind. And so we always thought that you had to kind of do well enough in the rural areas to win, and you'd win it in the urban areas. So we had the mirror image. I always thought that because there were so many South Georgia Democrats, voters and legislators, who were Republicans on the national level, that if we could ever win the governor's race, that what would happen was a lot of those people would just switch over, and the state would flop right over to being a 60% Republican state. Now it's not really a 60% Republican state, but that's kind of what happened. I mean, the people, once it became possible to get elected in their own area as a Republican, they ran as Republicans.
They did. That had, even though I accelerated it with the flag vote, that was coming. I mean, and I had seen that it was coming, and I was trying to form a new coalition. And if you look at what we pushed at the time, it was all bent to that suburban-urban center. It was transportation, green space, things like that I knew that appealed to it. And that is what I see happening now. But I was just too far ahead. And so I think, I knew things were changing when Barack Obama took 46% of Cobb County in 2008. 2012, I think he took 47.5 in 2008, fell down to about 46 in 2012. But I knew that things were changing here, and I knew things were changing in Gwinnett because the same thing was happening. Because this was an 80-20 county. I mean, Mac-Mattingly. I mean, you look at Ronald Reagan, Mac-Mattingly, and all that. Cobb County elected Mac-Mattingly. I mean, it was the one that's coming. So it was an 80-20, and then to get to 45, 46, 47, I knew that was changing. And that is changing, like I say, in the counties. Now, will there be a state? I mean, I think what will happen over a period of time, nobody knows if it takes 4 years, 8 years, 12, or whatever, Georgia will be an Ohio, a swing state that can go about either way. And it's almost there now.
Do you think that?
I know Roy means to pay me a compliment by calling me a moderate. I'm a conservative.
Yeah.
And I want to,
you can keep saying that.
Yeah, I know he means it as a compliment, so I don't react badly to it. But I'm a conservative. I think that there's a difference between politics in big urban counties and politics in small rural counties. And one of the differences is small communities tend to hang together.
Yeah.
And because there are just not enough people who are willing to take part in politics, who are sort of, if you will, the natural leaders of their community. It's a small group in most places. And so smaller communities tend to kind of move as a unit, whereas in bigger places like Cobb County, Fulton County, you have many units. And so, Fulton County, you can have various leadership groups in Fulton County, and some of them are for the Republicans and some of them for the Democrats. You don't really have that so much in smaller communities. They tend to take action together, and that's been historically the pattern for hundreds of years. So I think the Democrats are going to make inroads in the urban areas. I think the Democrats are not going to have much luck turning around the change in the rural areas. I think I think that train's left the station.
There's two comments I have that on the rural areas. Number one is the mechanization of agriculture has depopulated a lot. I represented Irvin County about 3 years ago. And while I was preparing for they had their largest industry, a private prison, had gone into bankruptcy, and I was trying to collect the taxes. They were the largest taxpayer there. And so I was in the bankruptcy court, and so when I was researching my closing argument. I went back and looked at the population of Irvin County in 1900, and it was 13,000 some people. And the population in 2010 was 9,000. And so their population had decreased 1/3. Now, so what's happening in those places is, in the larger communities, there are like Valdosta and Albany and Macon and and other places like that. There's these dynamics that are still in the rural area. I mean, still in the urban areas that Bob just talked about. And the other thing too is African Americans have been very loyal to the Democratic Party since 1960. The Republicans gave away the African American vote. I mean, they should have been. They were the party of Lincoln, and in fact, early on, and it's what's called the moderation of the moderation I talked about, Republican leaders. They were a very important part of their coalition, but they gave it away for several reasons, and a lot of it they're socially very close to the Republicans, but their economic and their rhetoric has driven them away. But in those local counties, a lot of those rural local counties, they have kept a Democratic sheriff, for example, and a Democratic commissioner because there's an African American vote. And that's a big change that has occurred since the 70s. When I first ran statewide in 1992, was it 1990? I'm sorry, yeah. I get mixed up. In the polling, even though the African American vote was the registration was about 25%, we weighted them at 19% because there was an underperformance of African American votes. Now their population is 30, the African American population is 30, and they're voting 30. Now that is the most remarkable change that's occurred in politics in my lifetime. And that's one of those things that I think the dynamic in the rural areas is changing, but mainly because of mechanization of agriculture and more land and timber, and the mechanization in that.
You ask about the problems of the state in the 90s, and we talked some about the politics in the 90s. I thought that what the state was dealing with in the 90s was really the problems of prosperity. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's I'm talking about Zell Miller's tenure now, mostly in the 90s, but the state budget went up $1 billion every year in the 90s. And I sometimes referred to it after the fact as the roaring 90s because, the state was growing so much and there was so much money coming in that the question was not, how do you find enough money to run the government, but how do you spend all the money you got? And it's easy to make mistakes when you do that because there's no end of worthy causes. I mean, the state could spend a budget of $100 billion a year. New York State does. By the way, it's astonishing to me that New York State is probably twice the size of Georgia, maybe
Georgia's
two and a half
10
times.
million. Georgia is now larger than Ohio in population.
You know what New York State's budget is? $150 billion. So it's like
that's real money.
That's real money.
For a state that's 2.5 times maybe the size, the budget is 7 times the size. It's unbelievable. Yeah. New York City is $50 billion by itself.
And New York City and the state of Georgia about the same. Well,
about the same size.
About the same size. A little bit. Georgia's a little.
And so when you have lots of money coming in, the issue is how really ought you to structure this? What ought you to spend it on? Not just spend everything you got. So I think funding the rainy day fund was a good thing to do. I always thought that the most important bill that I ever put my name to, didn't pass, but was a bill relating to limitation of the amount of the the gross domestic product that could be consumed by taxation. Because the only way to limit just the political dynamic is the legislature or a city council or a county commission, are never going to cut spending. I mean, I don't mean that 100%, but that's the trend, right? You spend everything you got and everything you can borrow. And so the only way, if you actually believe in smaller government, the only way to reduce spending is to somehow put a cap on the amount of taxes that can flow in, because everything that flows in is going to get spent. And so I think really the problem of the 90s was trying to figure out how not to get yourself in trouble by funding things that, if there were ever a downturn, which of course there's always a downturn, and there was, are going to cause you problems, so that you don't get yourself into the situation we were in 1975, where you have to come back and cut the state budget. And in that case, it was cutting teacher salary increases.
Bob, we haven't talked about this, but here's the rules I used, the percentages I developed over the years and that I used when I was governor. Georgia has a limitation on debt. It has a provision that says you can't issue more debt than 10% of the prior year's revenue would sink the debt in the highest year of payment. My rule was to keep that at 5. My rule also was to try to take the RSR, the reserve, to 8. I got it up to 6. Now, during the time I was governor, we had the crash and the internet and all this other stuff, and then we had 2011 and 2001, September 11, 2001, and but I still had a pretty good economy, but I was trying to take that, and I do agree that there has to be some limitation. I think it's what's wrong with Congress, is they don't, and it's, as we have seen, it is Democrat and Republican. I mean, just through this recent tax cut, and whether the tax cut was good or bad or whatever, the idea that you would incur a debt, whether it's Democrat or Republican, to without cutting, there's nothing to do. I mean, there's no balance there, and it creates an illusion. But I think, and the other thing that the way I set the revenue of the state was the governor. Georgia has a great budget system. The governor sets revenue estimate, and the General Assembly cannot change it. I set the revenue estimate at the prior year's receipts, actual receipts. And so that if I had growth of extra money after I got the permission to go to 8%, Murphy wanted, now I had to go to Murphy to pass that, because a lot of the House folks, they wanted to spend that money. That when he said, yes, you were right on that, I could put it to the reserve without it being there to appropriate. And I think the Congress needs the U.S. Constitution. I'm very reluctant about amending the Constitution of the United States, but I'm going to tell you, I have come to a point that I think there needs to be a balanced budget amendment. I think the greatest threat to our security is the fiscal irresponsibility of Congress in the last few years. I mean, Democrats always say they're a tax crowd and a deficit crowd. Of course, the last balanced budget we had at national level was Bill Clinton.
And Newt Gingrich.
Yeah, well, Newt was gone by then.
Well, by the last one.
Yeah.
I think Newt and Bill Clinton together actually made a pretty good team fiscally.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. That's probably true. But anyway, he'd been a governor in a state that had to balance a budget. And then I remember his last State of the Union address. He says, if you will not mess with the tax system, the deficit will be paid in 10 years from what we're taking in right now. And of course, we know what's happened, and we've had these wars and everything else. But I think that you should have an escape valve that says, unless 3/5, 60% of the Congress and approved by the President an emergency declared, you have to do a balanced budget. I think it's the greatest impediment we have. Now, the state of Georgia has increased its debt too, a little too much, but it's growth. I mean, it can handle that. So, you know, there's a lot of things. And I guess the discussion that we've just had there is a good example of the way things used to be. I hate to say that, but, you know, I could have these conversations because I was considered by the Democrats a little too conservative on fiscal matters because I came out of a business background. And I could have these conversations with Paul Coverdell. I could have them with Johnny. I could have them with Bob. I could have them, you know, and they supported them, you know. And a lot of times I couldn't have passed them without the support. In the House, the flag, the vote, and I've said this before. I mean, it was the Republicans that gave me the winning number.
And I was one of them.
And you were one of them. I mean, you know, you were one of them there. And, you know, now in the Senate, they'd everything, but the battle was in the House.
Go ahead, Bob.
I was just going to say, I think the other thing that Congress needs is another feature of Georgia, which is a limited session.
Yeah, I do too.
I mean, if the Georgia Constitution didn't provide for a limited session, the legislature would stay there all year. If the Georgia Constitution didn't provide for a balanced budget, never have a balanced budget. I mean, those are things that
if it didn't have a limitation on debt, they'd borrow everything.
Exactly. I mean, those are things that just, you know, if you don't provide for it in the Constitution, it'll never happen. And it was very striking to me. After I'd been in the House for 6 years, I got out to go to Harvard Business School, and my wife Lynn worked in the Massachusetts State House to put me through business school, and so, you know, we got to know members of the Massachusetts legislature, and Massachusetts did everything that the Council of State Governments in the 70s said you ought to do. They had a session all year. They paid the members to be full-time legislators. They gave them all aides. They, you know, provided, you know, big staffs for the committees. And I read the stuff that they produced, and it wasn't any better than the stuff we produced in 40 days without all that.
You know, there is some truth to that. I mean, you know, I used to go to those NC National Council State Legislatures too, and they were all pushing. I had a friend, he's dead now, a lawyer friend of mine, that said what happened to Congress when it went to pot was when they air conditioned the Capitol. He said that it used to be that it got so hot up there they had to come home and they'd go to the local restaurant and drink coffee, and somebody'd say, "What'd you pay so-and-so for that?" And they'd go back and straighten it out. He says after they air conditioned the Capitol, they stayed up there all the time.
You talked previously about South Georgia and depopulation of the rural areas. You know, we're coming up on fast approaching 2020, another census, and then reapportionment. And we could see possibly state Senate districts the size of congressional districts
Absolutely.
in some portions of South Georgia. What's going to be the effect on Georgia politics, Georgia government, when you have such a large geographical space with lots of needs, but so depopulated and with less and less influence in government as the population shifts north?
They're going to be hurt. I mean, there's no question about it. And, you know, I went through the reapportionment in 1980 and the one in 93 that we had, and then the one in 2000 or 2001. And I remember Paul and I went to the Department of Justice in 80. Of course, we were still under the pre-clearance. And Paul, we looked at the map and all, and he was a Republican, I was a Democrat, so we went to the Civil Rights Division to talk to him about our reapportionment. But we talked on the way up there about how many Senate seats would move from south to north. Mm-hmm. And that's continuing. That is being continued in each one. And so they lose influence. There's no question about it. And just look, look at, we have a governor, a lieutenant governor, and a speaker of the House that are all north of, well, really north of Atlanta.
North of Atlanta.
North
yeah.
Atlanta.
And so that influence is no question going to be impaired.
And yet I think the historical pattern has been, this was always striking to me, that the South Georgia guys partially made up by longevity what they lacked in numbers, because there'd be a lot of turnover in Metro Atlanta membership, and people from South Georgia would get there and they'd stay there, and so
then sometimes their daughter or son would come.
Oh, yeah.
Walter Cox and Kathy.
Kathy Cox. Oh, that's right. And
Yeah.
Jim Gillis.
Jim Gillis.
Hugh
Not
Gillis.
Jimmy Carter and Hugh Carter. Cousins,
Bob Lane.
Bob Lane,
you
Jones
know,
Lane, and Bob
Jones
Lane.
Bob
Yeah,
Lane.
that's right. So they'd sort of make up in longevity what they lost in numbers.
Jack Hill still.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jack Steele.
Appropriations.
Yeah.
Senate.
The number one, everything in all the problems of South Georgia come back to population and prosperity, but the thing that really is an issue right now is the health care situation, and it's a very difficult thing to deal with, because the truth of the matter is not every county actually needs an acute care hospital, but you need a system where you can get taken care of and stabilized and gotten to someplace that is an acute care hospital that's close enough where you need it. And we don't have, the system's not set up that way. And so people are really feeling the problem. And I'm not really quite sure what the solution to that is, but we need to find a solution to it. And let me give a compliment to Roy here. You are really the only governor that I served with that I think thought about managing the government. I think most governors most governors have a couple of priorities that they try to pursue, and that's enough. But they don't really think about all the aspects of the government, think about managing the government. You had some priorities too, but I do think that you thought about how the government as a whole functions, how much it costs, how it's managed, who the people are in it, and you're really the only governor that I served with who did that.
No, it's just the walk-in.
Well, maybe it is.
But to show you how far back antiquated we were, when I went into office in '99, but after I was elected, it was it was a great doubt of who's going to be elected. And after I was elected, and I knew I had to get the budget out, I called OPB and I said, I was used to dealing with trial balances. I said, can you run me a trial balance by department? But you don't have to give me all the detail, just give me the largest items. And they laughed. And they said, we don't have a uniform bookkeeping system. And that was the whole purpose of the technology, that we put in and everything is to have there was no cash management. You could just draw on the state treasury during the month. And I said, listen, we're going to have 24 hours that the treasury is going to be open, and then we're going to invest in overnights. There's about when I was there, $40 billion coming through there. I said, just look at what the carry is to the float. But I'm not sure that, it's not that other governors were unconcerned about it, but I'd served in the legislature a long time. Others had, but I tend to be more detailed, and particularly on financial matters, and I want things to balance. And that was what was tough. And I had a heart, and you have
you had a business background, and I've got a business background,
Yeah.
so I appreciated that. I'm not sure everybody actually appreciated that.
No, they did
but
not. The department head screamed bloody murder. What do you mean interfering with the way I'm running this department? Now, I did an audit. I brought in a series of audits to be done. And there's a little-known board called the State Depository Board. And it's the governor and the revenue commissioner. And you're not supposed to be able to open an account unless the State Depository Board says it's okay. I I said, I want to audit that. I found accounts everywhere. And then I found that I said, I want to see which ones were not drawing interest. And Renee Blumenthal, who was in the governor's office, I got her from OPB and she was there. Renee calls me one night at the mansion. She says, do not shoot the messenger. I said, what? She said, I found an account that has over 10 million average funds in it, and it's not drawing interest. And I said, what is it? She said, it's the state health benefit account. And it said, in fact, we have so many checks going through, they're charging us $20,000 or $30,000 a month to process. I won't tell you what bank it was. I asked her, I said, what bank? I said, I want you to find the highest ranking member. Put your hands on that's in town and have him in the office at 7:30 in the morning. She came in, I told him, I said, listen. And he came in and said, Governor, we didn't know this was the state's account. I said, it says state health benefit. And I made him pay back 3 years of interest. And I told him, I said, you better go check every one, because if there's one, I'm going to close every account the state has. And you can sue me, but as long as I'm sitting in this chair. Well, you know, that's just common business sense to me. It's not rocket science. It's just common business.
But most governors, I don't think, have paid attention to that.
I don't think. You're probably right. I mean, you know, but the General Assembly is a great training ground. I mean, you know, and that's one great thing about longevity. You'd have Mickey Chanel, for example. Mickey Chanel from down in Greensboro is an expert on Medicaid. He can tell you anything there. Jim Martin could tell you everything there was about Medicaid. And you built up expertise. I'm not sure that's there now. They're coming and going pretty quickly.
What are the things, we've talked a lot about how politics has become more contentious, more heated. What are the issues that Democrats, Republicans can work together on and need to work together on?
Go ahead,
both
Bob.
now and looking ahead.
Well, I think the central issue that governments at all levels need to deal with, but we're focusing on the state of Georgia, is creating the conditions to create prosperity. I mean, nothing brings society together like prosperity. If people can see a better life for themselves, then they're more likely to get along with other folks who are also seeing a better life for themselves. So if you create sustainable prosperity, I think that cures a lot of ills. And so to me, the thing that the Democrats and Republicans need to work on together, most of all, are all the things that create prosperity. And so that's education, and it's public safety, and it's tax policy, and it's health care, and a variety of things like that everybody ought to be able to have reasonable conversations about. You may not always agree, but ought to be able to have reasonable conversations about. And that's why this issue of civility in politics and in society at large, I think, is so important, because you need to be able to have the conversation. I think those are things that there's an ability to have a conversation about. But if civility breaks down, then you can't have the conversation. But to me, that's the central issue for the future of the state, the country, the city, everything. It's the conditions that create a sustainable prosperity.
I think that's right, and I'd amplify it a little bit. My saying was always, keep business running and stay out of their way, except where there's a balance there. You don't want pouring waste into rivers and things like that, but there's a balance there. And you'll have enough money to run the state. That was always my theory. Now, there's a balance, and you have to be careful in the balance. I think, for example, all of these tax credits and everything else, even though I had pushed some, I did it for rural Georgia, trying to attract some industry there. I think our tax system has become much in the state and we don't know what's going to happen in the national. I mean, we've got a new bill, but I don't even have there's no regs for it. There's no anything else. But in the state, I think our tax system has become much too special interest based. And I would much rather prefer a broader base and a lower rate. And I think that's what happens. So I think that's number one. Number two is training workers. Even during the deep recession, we had the greatest number of unfilled jobs. And you know why? Because the skills did not match the jobs. And I think that is the great challenge in the state. And it is something that should be a common goal of all. I think that you should be able to go to technical college absolutely free. Now that was true under Zell because you didn't have to have a grade point average, and now they have all this other stuff. And I think that technical colleges ought to be absolutely free. And I think that we should have a money back, an employee back guarantee to employers. If we don't train them correctly, you send them back to us and we will retrain them at no cost. Now, I think those are things that should be a broad-based agreement on. However, Bob is exactly right on this. If you don't like the person that you're talking to and you think that that person is evil, you cannot have those exchanges. And how did we get there? How did we get from the days of Paul Coverdell being one of my best friends and Bob's best friend, and to today where they don't even talk to each other? And if they do, somebody criticizes them for being a rhino or a dino or whatever it is. I don't know what the opposite of the Democrat is.
I knew some dinos as well as some
rhinos. I mean, how did we ever get there? I mean, I just want to take them and shake them and say, listen, this is not the way you do this. There's a time and a place to fight, but not here. Let's get something done. I mean, I'm just, it is very troubling to me.
And I think, as we've talked about before, I think this is a symptom of a larger problem in society. But I don't think you have to solve the whole society problem to be able to solve the problem of people in public office, being civil to each other.
I don't either. I agree with that. But there has to be an effort.
There has to be an effort.
There has to be an effort of civility. And of course, I'm used to dealing with, a very adversarial system in the practice of law. And I spoke to a group of young lawyers 2 weeks ago, and the judges had me, and one of the first things I tell them is, you don't have to hate the fellow or woman that's sitting at the other table. Some of them are going to end up being some of your best friends. But
maybe sitting at your table in 5 years.
Maybe sitting at your table in 5 years. And, lawyers, good lawyers, now, there's a lot of lawyers, they're just going to be attack dogs forever. But good lawyers, the top lawyers, they understand that, and they have a mutual respect. In fact, you'll have lawyers that'll send an email when a suit's filed, a lawyer that's defending it says, I'm glad you're on the other side. I've enjoyed working with you before. No, we'll be able to work here. But that same thing needs to happen in politics. And maybe I'm just getting old, but it seems at a worse state now than it's ever been. And there's just a lack of respect. And listen, I may disagree with, a lot of the tenets of, particularly on a national Republican level, but I respect the people that hold that office. And I respect the right they have for their views, What's happened to the old adage, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.
Mm-hmm. I was listening to a program, I believe it was on GPB, and I don't remember for the life of me who said it, but it was about this conversation we're having about partisanship and rhetoric. And I think his point was the candidates, the public office holders are just giving the voters what they want.
Well, then they shouldn't be elected because they're not leaders. I mean, you know, Bob, when he was minority leader and I was governor, he let me come to the Republican caucus several times to talk. Closed doors, asked me questions to be able, I said, listen, we need to do this, and this is good for all of us, it's good for the state. I don't know, can you imagine Chuck Schumer going to the to Mitch McConnell's conference or vice versa? I mean, but why shouldn't you do that?
Yeah, why shouldn't you? I mean, that's the,
I just don't understand it. And
you don't have to agree with people to be nice to them.
to be nice to them.
And being nice to them increases the chances that you'll find common ground. I mean, go all the way back. I'm not saying Tom Murphy's to blame for this, but that was a striking difference. I said it before, between George L. Smith and Tom Murphy. I mean, George L. Smith was nice to everybody. Doesn't mean you got what you wanted. Doesn't mean he didn't get what he wanted. He did. But he was nice to everybody, and being nice to each other increases the chances that you will find the ground that you do agree on. Because if you start out not liking the person, then the conversation never really goes anywhere.
Well, linking those issues of the last two, demonization of the other and economic development, one of the issues that I didn't hear mentioned was transportation. Mass transit, and Governor Barnes, you're from Cobb County. This was a county where one individual, I believe his name was Emmett Burton.
Oh, I remember him.
A very colorful character. Said that he would stock the Chattahoochee with piranha if it meant keeping Atlanta out of Cobb County. Joe Mack Wilson said he would like to build some forts along to keep MARTA out, to keep Atlanta from expanding out into Cobb County. That sort of suburban resistance to Atlanta, suburban resistance, not just Cobb County, I don't mean to pick on Cobb,
No,
but
Cobb
Gwinnett,
was the most pronounced.
Yeah.
Gwinnett County as well. Is that still an issue? Is that resistance still present? Or is it breaking down?
It's breaking down, and it's for a lot of the same reasons. Traffic has become much more, and in the late '80s, I gave a speech to I was still in the Senate, and I gave a speech to the Cobb Chamber, in which I said it's time for us to join the MARTA. Of course, I had opposition that year. And
You said other things they like better.
and it was such a row, and everybody, as Joe Mack Wilson told me, he says, "You're crazy, man," and everything else. Even Joe Mack had changed by the time of his death, because he was mayor of the city of Marietta, and he saw the change that was coming. They're ready for mass transit. There was a town hall meeting by some of the legislators in Smyrna, and it was reported in our Marietta Journal this week, and 70% of the crowd, they estimated, was in favor of mass transit. Now, that was the whole purpose behind Greta, was that I could create this in which you supported.
I did.
Where we could create this.
I had doubts about it,
the region-wide, so that I never said this, but I had planned for MARTA to become a part of the Georgia Department of Transportation, because I knew that was the only way I could sell some of it to be done. And we had proposed the light rail to be elevated over 75, 85, and 285. And then, of course, you got to balance to keep the trucks out. I was in favor of doing a northern arc. And I was going to, after I connected 85 to 75, I didn't tell them this, but I was going to swing west and connect into the Fall Line Freeway south of Newnan, and so that a truck leaving Savannah could never have to come in Atlanta. But that was all, and there was a big controversy about that. I think that is breaking down. I think they're ready. And I remember I was talking to the CEO of Hewlett Packard about putting another building, because they have a building on 285. And I don't remember who it was. I mean, they've changed CEOs, but he or she told me, I think it was a gentleman, said, why in the world will I put another building and my people can't get in there now? And so now you have folks like Brandon Beach, who is North Fulton, and you have people like Terry Anulowitz, who just got elected to the House when she was in Smyrna. They have all become big proponents of mass transit. And I think it's long overdue, and I see it breaking down. I think the first place it's going to come is in South Cobb, because it's close there. But I think there's been a big push by the business to want to connect Cumberland Mall with Town Center Mall and with mass transit. So I think it's breaking down.
And this is a problem that needs to be thought about whole, right?
Yes.
I mean, the transportation is a complex issue, and the solution to the whole thing is not just more MARTA.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a part of it. But new highways are part of it. Busways are part of it. I'm a big fan of busways as a part of the solution, because they're not nearly as expensive as a fixed rail. And so it needs to be thought of as a whole. And I agree that the climate is changing. This is one of those issues I think that was not solvable 20 years ago, and now is solvable. I mean, times change. People respond to what the conditions really are.
And I agree with that. And don't get me wrong. I think that improvements on interstates. Listen, the largest jam in the state is I-20 and 285. And if it backs up, the studies were showing that you have to have some more roads. I think you have to be able to get around Atlanta. The trucks are the problem. And when you have to come down to 285 to make that north-south change, you've got to get those trucks on the road, the outer perimeter, and then, or whatever you want to call it, and then going on down. I was going to put no speed limit. I was going to toll it heavy, but I was going to put no speed limit on it.
When I was running for the U.S. Senate, I got the chance to fly around with Captain Herb one day.
Yeah.
And it's very striking when you look at traffic from the air. I mean, anything can happen in any particular place. There could be an accident that backs up. But day after day after day, what backs up is the intersections. And you're absolutely right that I-20 West and 285 is dependably the worst. And so, one of the things that's always been an idea that I thought we ought to pursue is having 2 or 3 lane exits instead of 1 lane exits, because everybody has to squeeze down to 1 lane to get on the other road. And it's very dependable. That's what backs up every day. There are some places that there's an accident, like on 365, and today you have a problem today, but you don't have a problem every day. You have a problem with those intersections every day. And it's a design problem.
And then, of course, there's the folks who want to turn left to get into Chick-fil-A at Rush. but we've talked about suburban growth, ex-urban growth out in Cherokee and Forsyth and Jackson County and Barrow County anymore. But the city of Atlanta, for the longest time, was shedding population, 1970s, 1980s, up into the 1990s. Why do you think that population trend has reversed and the city of Atlanta, Midtown, Buckhead, really strong population growth? Why do you think that's the case? And what's that going to do to Georgia politics with a robust, growing city of Atlanta as opposed to just the suburbs?
I don't know how much the city is actually going to grow. I mean, is the city going to double in the course of even 30 years? I doubt it. But you're right. I mean, the trend is reversed, and I think that's a healthy thing. Part of it, I think, is just generational. I mean, to some extent, people don't want to do what their parents did, right? So parents move to the suburbs. They want to live in town. And I've always thought that a key to Atlanta being able to continue to attract residents like that is to have, if you will, the cultural and the sports attractions in town. I mean, I think, the Braves didn't move very far out of downtown, but I think it was, to me, better for, everybody when the Braves were in downtown. I don't mean to criticize the Braves. I'm using them as an example, of I think, if you have attractions like that, people want to live closer to them, and I think that's one of the things. But there's been talk over time about how small a percentage of the metro area the city of Atlanta is. And look, metro areas are just different, right? I mean, New York City is a big part of the New York metro area. But Boston is not a big part of the Boston metro area. Boston's about the same percentage of metro area as Atlanta is. So, and that area is very prosperous. So, I mean, you can be prosperous and you can have, good dynamics over a long period of time, whether the central city is a big part of the area or not.
I think a lot of it is generational. I agree with Bob. And a lot of it's that cultural, freedom. Young folks are getting married later. So, I mean, they're not getting married till the 30s. And so there's longer periods they like to live closer in and where there's cultural amenities. But it's just not only the city of Atlanta. Look at Smyrna. Smyrna is a good example. I mean, the city of Marietta. Let me tell you something. You come up here on Saturday night or Friday night, it's packed. And when I came back from law school in the early 70s, 40% of that square was vacant. And I think that is several things. One is it is a longing of the sense of community. Even among young folks, it is a longing of a sense of community. And I think that's a good thing, to be quite frank with you, that's happened. And I think it's transforming the city of Atlanta. I think it's transforming the city of Marietta. It's already transformed the city of Smyrna.
Recently in the news, there's been discussion of creating a city of Eagles Landing down in Henry County. The proliferation of new communities like Sandy Springs, Johns Creek, for a long time has been seen as a partisan issue. The Republican wants.
It became a partisan issue.
Well, let's talk about that and the concern, the belief or the concerns of some that what's next, a city of Buckhead or the county of Milton. Mm-hmm. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So I gave a speech in 1975 to the Sandy Springs Chamber of Commerce, in which what I said was everything inside Fulton County ought to be municipalized, that everything in the county ought to be inside some city, because there's certain kinds of services that smaller government cities provide better, and there are certain kinds of services that counties provide better, and the county is not going to be as good as the city at land use and police and things like that. So I actually think the number of new cities that have been created is a good thing. I think it's gotten government closer to people. It's generally happened because the people of a particular community, for one reason or another, were dissatisfied with the county government. And for a long time, the legislature never would do it. It became a partisan issue. But in my view, it never should have been a partisan issue. I mean, people can disagree about whether it's a good idea, but it never should have been a partisan issue. But it became a partisan issue because, frankly, because Tom Murphy was very dependent in the House on the House Black Caucus, and the House Black Caucus was very opposed to anything that could be seen as blocking the expansion of the city of Atlanta, and so it could never get through the House, really because of that internal House dynamic, and so it became a partisan issue in a way that it never should have been.
I disagree. I think that this proliferation of all these governments is going to be ashes in the mouth in a few years. Which sounds crazy. I'm for smaller government. I mean, Bob's for creating more governments, and I'm not.
Smaller governments.
Yeah, I hear you. Eagles Landing is a good example. I mean, and there's a racial undertone in many of these. Eagle Landing is primarily African American. Stockbridge is, and McDonough are not, particularly Stockbridge, where they're trying to take it off from. And I think there's been a racial basis. I won't say to all of them, but at least to a substantial number of them. Now, what's going to be interesting is Sandy Springs, I've been looking at the population numbers up there. Sandy Springs is changing rapidly. And I think what's going to happen, for example, when they have an African-American government, they're going to say, well, we should, that's what we wanted all along. What troubles me, and I won't say that's all of them, and there's some legitimate concerns about some land use and other things, but for a county that's already developed and is providing all of the services, I mean, what additional service is there that you're going to get from a city, from a smaller city paying more taxes? Because that's what eventually, when you create a government, it will grow, and you may not have any taxes at the beginning, but you're eventually going to have them. And I think that as some of these changes occur, I think that it's wrong. The main problem I have is just from them. I generally believe that you let people do what they want to, but not if it has an underlying racial basis to it. And I'm concerned about several of the ones that I've seen that appear to me from the outside to be, well, I just don't like it because it's majority black.
So let me come back on that for just a minute to talk about the land use issue. When I was in the legislature the first time, we lived in Roswell. And even in a developed area, there's always zoning issues because somebody wants to develop it more intensively, right? So there's always land use issues. It's always, the neighborhood against the, somebody that wants to develop it. And when we lived in Roswell, you could go to Roswell City Council about the zoning issue, and they'd listen to the neighborhoods. I mean, they'd listen to the developer also, but they would really listen to the neighborhoods. And why is that? It's because the neighborhoods voted on the Roswell City Council. Then we lived in Sandy Springs, and another, developed area, but people want to develop it more intensively, and so you have zoning issues. And you go down to the Fulton County Commission in those days for Sandy Springs zoning issues. There was one commissioner who lived in Sandy Springs.
Tom Lowe.
No, at that time, Lee Roach.
Lee Roach, okay.
One commissioner lived in Sandy Springs. A majority of the commission not only lived in, but was elected by somebody completely different. And it was hard for you to get the neighborhood's point to get listened to, because these people, were elected by other folks, felt they had, if you want to put the best cast on it, broader responsibilities than to listen to this particular area. And so we lost a lot more often in Sandy Springs. We, the neighborhoods, lost a lot more often in Sandy Springs than we lost when we were in Roswell. That was the flashpoint for the desire to create the city of Sandy Springs. There were other issues. It became a partisan issue. It became a racial issue on both sides, and never should have been any of those things. But the land use issue, the zoning issue, the protection of the neighborhoods issue is a real issue, and I think that, I know that drove a lot of the interest in Sandy Springs, and I think it probably has driven a lot of the interest in other cities as well.
Let me just say one thing. This is a good example. I mean, you can discuss things and disagree. The use of property should not be based on how many shows up to, and the law says this, how many shows up for or against. It should be based upon a reasonable use of the property. Of course, I'm a lawyer, and I have a very strong feeling on the use of property. Now, there's balance. You don't put a fertilizer plant in the middle of a subdivision, However, it should not be up to the whims, and maybe that's a call that we should reconsider the whole system of the way we plan and zone property. But what I see at a lot of zonings, I used to represent folks in zonings, but I don't now. I see a lot of folks, we want 2,500 square foot houses. Well, that has priced out most of the working folks in the metropolitan area. You say, well, I'm going to build a 1,500, which is a pretty good size house, 1,500, 18. Oh no, you're going to destroy my neighborhood. In other words, I told, back when I was doing zoning, I told a lady one time, and I'll tell you where it was. I was representing Home Depot, where their headquarters is now. And they, on the other side over there, they had had a strip center where they had a buying center. And I represented them in that, and this lady said, at the meeting I went to, Bernie Marcus was with me. He chastised me about this afterwards. She said, I said, well, what's the problem here? I said, this is a heavily developed area. I said, what's the problem? Well, when I wash dishes, I look out and I see those beautiful trees, and you're going to tear those trees down to build that building. She says, you're going to destroy my quality of life. And I said, well, ma'am, I've lived here all my life. I said, when y'all got here, you tore my fences down and let my cows out. I said, you changed the quality of my life. So do you think these folks shouldn't be able to use their property because you were the last one to move? We got in the car and Bernie says, I don't think we did too well in that.
Well, we've all seen situations like that. Anybody that's lived in one area for a long time seen situations like
sure.
that. I have too. But I will say, I mean, when we moved to Buckhead, Lynn became the president of our neighborhood association.
She needs combat pay.
Well, and I mean, that's one of those things that, once you take it, you can't ever give it up, right? But we had a major zoning fight every year for the first 10 years that we lived there. And generally what would happen, because the best thing about the Charter of the City of Atlanta is the creation of the neighborhood planning units, the NPUs, because they provide a channel for local residents, neighborhood residents, to be involved in zoning issues that is something other than just showing up at a hearing and objecting. Provides an opportunity for negotiation between the neighborhood leaders and the developer. And that's the way most of these zoning fights ended. They ended in some kind of a modification of what it is that the developer wanted to do that the neighbors could live with. Now, occasionally that didn't happen. Occasionally we had to beat them. You talk about Bernie Marcus. I mean, the biggest one that we had was with Arthur Blank. Arthur Blank wanted to put a football field for Pace Academy on West Paces Ferry Road. They called it a soccer field, but everybody knew it was going to eventually be a football field. And so we, the neighborhood, had to raise $100,000 to oppose that, and we got it beat. But most of the battles ended in some kind of a modification and a compromise. I mean, I hear all the legal arguments, and I have some sympathy with that, but neighborhoods have to be able to protect themselves. I come out of the neighborhood association milieu, and neighborhoods have to be able to protect themselves.
Thank you very much, Governor Barnes, Representative Irvin, for a lively, far-ranging discussion.
And civil discussion.
And a civil discussion. We're always civil here at the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.